Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and continue our discussion on the French Revolution by moving into an important transition of that revolution, a particular person that takes over the military of France under the Assembly, the new French Revolutionary Army that is made up of some nobles that basically gave up their nobility to remain alive and in France, and others were a lot of the just members of the populace who found an opportunity to become involved in the French military for glory and honor, but mostly for pay that they didn't have before. And France's military is going to be pretty huge at this time because it is not only fighting a civil war between two different factions, between itself, meaning the people of France versus the nobility of France that are still fighting on the edges of the borders of the country where they've kind of formed bastions of defense, but also there's going to be other countries invading France at the same time for two reasons. And we'll get into that in a minute. But I just wanted to show you some pictures of Napoleon that they're all very propagandistic images. Some are French and some are English. You can see that this man started out pretty young and pretty dashingly, this military soldier who continues on to something like this, which is a whole nother kind of image from this. This is the young man going forth to fight, and this is somebody else entirely over here on his horse, looking like an emperor, if anybody does. Seasoned military commander, again, an emperor that looks like he's dressing himself in the trappings of ancient Rome. The brooding man on the island of St. Helena. We'll discuss that in a bit too. And then the British view, this kind of move that you've got a little Napoleon over here trying to cut up parts of Europe and Britain over here trying to cut up parts of Europe. And then, of course, we get to images that are less flattering, showing a crazed Napoleon Baker essentially killing and getting rid of all the old kings and then replacing them with new kings that he picks of Europe, and basically upsetting and changing the entire the world order of the time for Europe from the European view. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Napoleon. I can do a lecture easily in like 2 or 3 weeks on this guy because there's so much that happened with him, but we are in a history survey course, which means we're brushing over history as far as getting the basic context of what happened and why it's important, and that's about as specific as we are allowed to get. I often do more about Napoleon in History 195 as our last lecture, and then if anybody ever wants to get into, we have an honor society at OCC, or at least we're building one, and it's called CATI, Kappa Alpha Theta Iota. I'd remember that. It's been a long time since we've been on campus. And that particular honor society is a great place to meet up and say, hey, we'd like to talk more about Napoleon and why, and we can get into the specifics of him, because I like to study his military tactics and his particular psychology of leadership and that sort of thing. He's a fascinating guy. The reason why I show you this image right here is because you'll see what France looks like at around 1792. Okay, so we look right here. France is where my little laser pointer is, if you can see it right here. This is the actual people of France, the revolutionary country of France. This is what they have. The rest of France is in these little sort of factions of ancient families that are, the nobles that kind of ran these territories that are still fighting for their nobility, their leadership of France under their own old heritage, everywhere from Flanders up here all the way down to the coastlines of France. So there's several hundred miles each way down here that are still under the control by 1792 of the nobles that are all kind of fractured up. And what these nobles are asking for is for help from their families, and the families of any one European nation were related to any other family of any other European nation through marriage and, noble families and lands and titles. That's just the way the old feudal system evolved into the modern empire system. And so all these people are related to everybody else. So what happens is you've got revolutionary France here fighting for a new type of country in Europe. And then you've got the rest of these guys saying, hey, we need help from the Spanish and the British and the Austrians and everyone else that doesn't want this to happen to them, this revolution. And so from Spain all the way up, you've got armies of Europeans coming in to invade France at the same time as France is fighting for its own independence from the old regime, the old rule. The other reason why people are invading is because it's easy prey. The British have a chance to invade yet again, like they used to in the not too distant past before this, the 1400s, for instance. Basically, just to raid and take stuff, and other countries can too. It's a chance to send armies in, quote unquote, to reset the old order and help their noble friends. But it's also a chance to steal things from people and raid the churches and loot the farms and that sort of thing. So that's just what happens when a country is down, as everyone else invades, which is why you never want to be down. Okay, so these are all the countries over here on the left, the countries and territories that are currently sending armies into France for raiding and pillaging, and also some of them for the specifics of trying to reset the map there and turn France back into a monarchy again. So the United Kingdom all the way down, France is fighting itself, the different groups. So we have the Dutch are invading the Holy Roman Empire, which is all those German states, right? And all the way down, you've got a lot of countries from islands down to provinces that are sending armies in. So France is in a bit of trouble, it's trying to reset itself as a new type of nation, and it's also trying to defend itself from foreign invasion. And in comes Napoleon. He becomes the guy that rises to the top of the French military as they're trying to defend against the enemy, the many enemies that are invading France. So he was an officer, under the king, Louis XVI, who gets beheaded. And he's a general by the age of 24, already a pretty smart guy and well-connected. But Napoleon does the smart thing, I suppose, in this case, and he does not throw in with the nobles and go to the outskirts of France to fight for independence to defend against the rebellion. He actually joins the rebellion. He kind of sees an opportunity in there to become someone that the rebellious French really don't have. They don't have a lot of skilled quality military officers because a lot of those officers are either dead or they have fled the country and are trying to defend against the rebellion. So Napoleon basically says, this is a chance for me to really rise in rank and do some amazing things as to defend this new country that has so much popular support, that 97% of the populace that wants this change. So he joins in with them and rises up the ranks of the revolutionary government of France. So one of the things that he does that gains him fame, he's not an emperor yet or a king or anything, he's just a general, is he takes a bunch of French troops, trains them to the level of any professional army in Europe, and then goes to Italy. And he invades Italy between 1796 and 1797, partially because the Italians were sending armies to invade France and raid and loot it during the Revolution. So he wants to stop the Italians, along with others, from invading France during this time. And so he goes in the 1790s into Italy and defeats all these different nations that were trying to defeat the French. So he actually defeats the Austrians, he defeats any Italian army in his way, and he basically captures northern Italy for French rule. Okay, so he defeats the army of the Austrians, which is a huge, powerful country at the time, defeats them just by superior tactics, and then captures northern Italy from the Austrians and from the Italians. So that's the first thing he does, and it makes him super famous. To give you an idea of the French borders where things are happening, you've got Sardinia sending armies up to invade this way. The British Navy is over here attacking Marseille. You've got the British fleet up here attacking Quiberon Bay near Brittany. You've got the British fleet over here attacking up near Cone. You've got the Prussians and Austrians coming in this way. So France is really in trouble here, right? It's under constant attack, and Napoleon is the guy chosen by the 1790s, the mid 1790s, to start pushing all these guys back and find some kind of peace. Okay, so the first Italian campaign that we'll focus on very briefly, Napoleon is leading a very under-equipped army. Remember that his country is in the middle of a civil war, so his people aren't very well equipped or trained even, so he's got to train them, and he trains them here. He makes them true believers of Napoleon by helping this under-equipped and basically underdog army to defeat some of the most powerful armies in Europe in this 1 year period. 18 major battles over a 10-month period to destroy what was called the First Coalition. We're going to talk about coalitions a lot in this PowerPoint lecture, which has to do with alliances of Europeans that are trying to stop France and especially to stop Napoleon. Okay, so the First Coalition is around for under a year. And that first coalition were the Austrians mostly, and and various Italian states. And that was really it. The British are kind of involved, but they're not doing much yet. They're kind of waiting to see what happens before they care about whether or not to deal with Napoleon in any way beyond just attacking and raiding coastlines. So right here, the real most powerful invaders coming into France, the Austrians and Northern Italians, and in 18 battles, Napoleon, with a pretty poor army, manages to defeat all of them. All of those guys of the first quote-unquote coalition. So the favorite techniques included here, I'm not going to give a big talk on military attack. I just want to say that Napoleon, he's kind of like, he's somebody with a new way of thinking about warfare at a time when people were used to doing things in a very specific way. And like that, I think the best comparison I can make right away is probably Alexander the Great when it comes to building big empires, because Alexander the Great, like Napoleon, was just real flexible, real intelligent, knew how to use his resources, along with really use a certain kind of psychological warfare as well to defeat his enemies, who were all fighting in a very old style and just were not very creative, frankly. And that's what he does here. This is what Napoleon does. He's a very creative thinker and manages to build an amazing military complex based upon a whole new concept of fighting. So when I say something like maneuver sur le derrière, that's just moving around the rear. Napoleon was really good at getting an enemy to launch its attack upon his main body of his army, and then having a huge hidden portion of his military ready to descend upon the back of the enemy army that they weren't thinking existed, that they had no idea was there. And so Napoleon's very good at this kind of quick and shock and awe sort of action, which no one else is really ready for. And for Napoleon to fight like that meant that he had to have generals that worked with him, that he trusted, to work like he did. And Napoleon would unlike any other nobles in Europe, Napoleon would actually find people for merit, not because of who their parents were from the old noble system. If he found somebody that was born on a farm who was a peasant who happened to be in his army, but who understood a new style of military tactics that Napoleon employed, then guess what? Napoleon would raise that person up to become a general or marshal, is what he called them, of his military, and send them out with his armies to go lead like he would, and he trusted them. And that's the sort of thing that caused him to have a lot of loyalty amongst his army, is because he promoted from within, from skill, as opposed to from family connections. That was something that was very different on its own. So maneuver around the rear, and also something called central position. This is a big one that he does a lot, and I'm going to actually talk about that separately when we get to it. What is the central position tactic of Napoleon? So just to give you an idea of the very first real battles that Napoleon fights, is this guy with this kind of cruddy army that has to be trained. And this is how they train. It's by training by fire, where you've got Napoleon with his generals over here, Jourdan and Moreau, with quite a few troops here, right? And they're going up against archdukes, okay? People from Austria who are coming in with a lot of conscripts out of the German states of the Holy Roman Empire. And these guys, trained by Napoleon, defeat these more powerful and better trained and better equipped armies. And Napoleon himself is right down here fighting against these guys, going in towards the Alps and towards Italy, and he defeats them. And this is just what happens. Napoleon trains these guys to fight in the style of which he thinks will win, because he understands how old school Europe is and how they're not very creative at this point with their military combat. So maneuver sur le derrière. It's all about faking an attack to the front while a main army goes around and attacks everything else, like the baggage trains and the headquarters of the army and everything, right? That if an army is invading your country and you're able to take out their supply lines, they freak out and panic and run away. That's something that he understood, and so he always employed that method. And then his army, the French army, was able to live off the countryside as they went in on the attack, which meant that they were pretty light and pretty fast and pretty well organized compared to the big monolithical armies of the enemy. So this is the central position idea. What you do here is you've got your main army right here, and your intelligence, your cavalry intelligence tells you, hey, there is an enemy army over here coming from Austria, and there's another enemy army over here coming from, say, Spain. What do we do? How do we fight them? Their two armies are going to join up together and then attack us, and they're going to be 2 or 3 times the size of our army. How do we beat them? Oh my gosh, right? And then Napoleon's move would be to actually take part of his army and just cut them off and put them under the control of a really competent general and send them to slow down an approaching enemy however they can, not necessarily to beat them, just to slow them down. And then Napoleon's main army will leave the central position, go and attack the enemy, the other enemy, defeat them, and then Napoleon's army can turn around and go and attack the other one that's on its way, that's been held off by Napoleon's little side force. He does stuff like that all the time. Just basic, what seems pretty obvious, but things that were not obvious to people of the time. And he was just good at it. He was good at delaying enemies who were trying to form together to make a large force to attack him by delaying or attacking the armies as they were coming into position before they could actually engage on their own terms. It's just the way he worked. He did this all the time. All right, what was he like as an emperor? Because what's going to happen is Napoleon's going to go into Egypt after a while, and he's going to gain fame by doing things that he's going to be raiding what will today be known as archaeological sites, and he's going to be he's going to find some important stuff like the Rosetta Stone. That's kind of a big deal. And he's going to defeat massive Ottoman armies. And then the British show up with a large army in eastern Egypt and, of course, the British Navy to cut him off, hoping to surround and capture Napoleon. By the way, this is 1799. It's before Napoleon is emperor, okay? It's before he's anything more than a general. And so Napoleon is about to get surrounded by a British army in the west of Egypt, the Ottomans in the east of Egypt, and the British Navy that goes off to attack the French Navy, which has to flee in a place called the Nile, the mouth of the Nile, and the Battle of the Nile that happens. So what ends up happening is Napoleon manages to actually escape northern Egypt, conscripts a bunch of fishing boats and whatnot, gets across the Mediterranean when no one sees him, and ends up in Italy, and then marches his army back to France triumphant, not having won anything except some battles and escaping much more superior forces that were sent to trap him. That alone, just the maneuverability of his way of thinking was enough to make him super famous. So much so that the people who were really sick and tired of the French revolutionary system, just imagine Les Mis, that whole opera that I always find to be kind of tiresome, but it's interesting, I suppose, the suffering of the French people. Those people, a lot of French were suffering under the new regime, the new revolutionary regime that really didn't do really well at governing France. And so they're looking for somebody to save them. And guess who walks back in with obvious skills to manage people? And that is Napoleon, who walks back in from Egypt in 1799. He's defeated the Austrians. He's defeated the different German states who had invaded France. He's defeated northern Italian armies, and now he has managed to escape an overwhelming British and Ottoman force that was trying to trap him, and he's back in France going, hey, what's next, And so he's really famous by 1799. Austria, Russia, and Britain form what's called the Second Alliance or Second Coalition, and they want to attack France and end the revolution. So Napoleon is going to be called up again to fight against the second coalition of these three guys. And during that time, while people were kind of freaking out about the fact that three major powers were sending their armies into France, Napoleon is going to convince the French people to overthrow the Directory, which was at that time the name of the French government, and put him in as a dictator. So he was calling himself a consul because that sounds less scary than dictator, and it's what the Romans called their... So he called himself a consul because, again, it sounded less threatening than emperor, and the people had just overthrown their king, so they weren't necessarily going to love having another king. So Napoleon made sure to simply not call himself a king, and that worked out, right? It's semantics. So in 1802, while we're waiting for the Austrians and the British to show up, right, and the Russians, in 1802, he names himself consul for life because no one really stopped him. And in 1804 is when he said, well, no one seems to care, and he named himself an emperor. And for the images here, he dresses himself up in all the trappings of the Romans, the Roman Empire, which is what he's going to borrow a lot of imagery from, like eagles and all that. What was Napoleon like as a leader? That brings us here. He censored newspapers, okay? He establishes a secret police like dictators like to do so that they can make sure that people don't try to talk against them or overthrow them. That's something Napoleon did a lot of. He had this guy, Joseph Fouché, who was the head of his secret police, did a lot of manipulation and torturing. He's going to issue lots of propaganda so that people believe a certain narrative of what Napoleon is and what he's trying to do. He sets his family above and apart the French people, so the only real nobles in France at this time are really the family of Napoleon. And whenever Napoleon conquers somewhere, he puts someone from his family in charge. So this is a very dictator-like thing to do, okay? When you have a leader come in and then puts all the members of their family in charge of the government, you kind of know that you have someone that wants to be a dictator, because that's just what they do. You know, they try to keep all the management of the government under one name. And so this is, you know, real basic aspects of Napoleonic rule that you could read more about if you want to really get into Napoleon. Europe under Napoleon, very quickly, you're going to have this French Empire, and Napoleon's going to have to go out and defeat the Austrians, and he's going to have to go out and defeat the British when they try to invade, and he's going to have to defeat everybody else, like the Russians. And so that's who he's going to be fighting all the way up through 1810, okay, between 1800 and 1810. It's all about defeating those normal armies that were the closest to him. And for the most part, except for the Navy campaigns, he's going to. So let me give you a video here on the Corps d'Armée, you know, just kind of what changes Napoleon made to the military that other European leaders will make later, because they're going to have to. It's going to be modernizing the militaries of Europe just through, here you go.
In the Napoleonic Wars, infantry fought in close order, packed together, standing shoulder to shoulder. But why present such an easy target for the enemy? First, command and control. Before radios, orders had to be relayed by shouted commands, drums or bugles. Difficult enough in the smoke and din of battle, almost impossible if troops were scattered. Second, firepower. Smoothbore muskets were inaccurate beyond about 80 yards, so volley fire, firing en masse, was the best way to inflict physical and psychological damage on the enemy. Third, morale. Soldiers were much more willing to advance into danger or hold the line if they did so together as a unit, urging each other on. Fourth, defense against cavalry. Scattered infantry were easy targets for horsemen. Only by sticking together could they fight them off. The basic tactical unit of infantry was the battalion. A French line battalion had, in theory, 840 men, but in practice, nearer 500 to 600. Our example here has 605 men, a typical strength for a battalion on campaign. The men were divided into 6 companies, 4 fusilier companies, and 2 flank companies. On the right, the grenadiers, made up of the tallest, strongest men, often detached to form elite all-grenadier units. And on the left, the voltigeurs, specialist light infantry used for skirmishing in front of the battalion. Skirmishers moved independently, used cover and fired at will to harass and unsettle the enemy, while preventing enemy skirmishers carrying out the same task. Most armies also had specialist light infantry units for this role, such as the British 95th Rifles, French Chasseurs à Pied, and Austrian and Prussian Jaeger battalions. The traditional battlefield formation was the line, all companies formed up alongside each other, 3 ranks deep. Line formation maximized the number of men who could fire their muskets at the enemy, and limited casualties from artillery fire. But it was extremely vulnerable to cavalry if it could be outflanked. And even for well-drilled troops, it was difficult to keep the line straight while advancing across broken ground. So for maneuver and attack, battalions usually formed a column of divisions. This was a more flexible formation that allowed the battalion to advance quickly, though it presented a larger target to enemy guns, firing solid round shot that would tear through several ranks, and far fewer men could fire their muskets at the enemy. Theoretically, therefore, the battalion would deploy into line before reaching the enemy. But carrying out this slow manoeuvre under fire wasn't always possible or sensible. So some commanders kept their men in column, relying on momentum to break the enemy line. This was a risky tactic that often worked against raw troops, but led to high casualties when facing better trained infantry, like British redcoats. A column could be closed up quickly to provide protection from cavalry, or if there was time, could form a square. With bayonets fixed, the battalion formed an all-round defence that often resembled more of a rectangle. Enemy cavalry could surround the battalion, but not break in, as horses won't charge a solid wall of men and steel. But an infantry square was extremely vulnerable to artillery fire, and could only move very slowly. Changing quickly and smoothly from one formation to another, especially under fire, required training, practice, and experience. In 1809, the Austrian army began to use the battalion mass formation, crude but more suited to hastily trained conscripts. This was a dense column with limited firepower and huge vulnerability to enemy cannon. But it could quickly close up to repel cavalry using the same principle as the square, but without the complex drill, and was much more maneuverable.
So, how are Napoleon's armies different? They're veterans. Very rarely do they see garrison duty where they just sit there and get fat. They're actually out there fighting. New recruits will learn by being mingled with the veterans. Napoleon prized eagerness and spirit over education. So the people that were educated were basically nobles or rich bourgeoisie. And although you had really good, smart people from there, they were also trained in a lot of bad old habits. And so Napoleon was really more into people he could train who were very enthusiastic rather than people who were really well versed in old styles of fighting and politics, if that makes any sense. Of Napoleon's 7 corps or 7 army units, only 2 were over 40. You know, the people that commanded the armies, only 2 were over 40 years old. They were all pretty young and pretty active and pretty fresh behind the ears. March 1802, and Great Britain is just going to kind of say, okay, all right, let's see peace between all of us. You know, maybe Napoleon really just wants to defend France, and let's let it be. So Europe is going to be at peace for about 2 minutes, and then there's going to be renewed fighting. All right. So what's going to happen is during this peacetime in 1802, Napoleon is going to set up a new policy called the Continental System, and that leads us to here. All right. The Continental System is where Napoleon sends out the French Navy, and that French Navy is going to force ships coming towards Europe to actually go to France first before they go to England. And the reason why that's kind of dumb and kind of crazy is because France relied on trade with oceanic kingdoms and states like the United States and Canada and new states that were starting to form down in South America, and of course overseas empires like India. And so France needed trade, and that trade comes from people coming from elsewhere, and you're sending goods out and goods are coming in from sea. And so Napoleon institutes this idea, the idea of the Continental System, and he offers everybody else in Europe to join him in the Continental System, which is we're all going to gang up against Britain. Everybody joins me, and we all trade with each other and with everyone else, but not Britain, because Britain sucks, and we're tired of Britain being a jerk about everything, and meh, Britain, right? And of course, Britain's mad about this, and they don't want trade going to Napoleon before it comes to England, so Britain's Navy is going to get involved. And countries like the United States are going to get stuck where U.S. merchant ships are going to be heading to anywhere in Europe as neutral ships to trade, and they'll get stuck. They'll either get captured by Napoleon's Navy or the British Navy, who will say, are you coming to England first? And they'll be like, no, we're on our way over to France. And then the British will just take the ship as contraband, or an American ship will be heading to England, and a French ship will capture it and say, hey, where are you going? Well, we're on our way to Britain because we're trading this thing with them. And the French will say, contraband. They're, the Continental System. You have to obey it. So the deal is that Napoleon basically has an economic war going with England. is what happens. Okay. So this is going to cause Great Britain to declare war in a year after the peace was signed. So between 1803 and 1805, Austria and Russia will form a third coalition against France. So it's Great Britain again, Austria and Russia, the third coalition, the British opposition to Napoleon. 1805, France tries to invade Great Britain, and this is where the British suddenly get real serious about their third coalition. So in 1805, France starts to board ships, starts to send soldiers aboard ships to get ready to invade Britain. The French Navy and the Dutch Navy, which was captured by the French, and the Spanish Navy, which was also captured by the French, are going to go up against the British Navy. And it's this huge battle, just a massive battle. And there's this guy that was already famous in England, but he becomes even more famous. He is the Horatio Nelson. He's like the Napoleon of the sea. And Horatio Nelson is going to take Britain's big battleships and take them up against the combined fleets of the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch. And the end result is that Horatio Nelson will win. He's going to win this battle for Britain, and Napoleon will never be able to go back to sea again to try to attack outside of the continent. So this is where Napoleon starts to get into the continental system. No trade between the European continent and Great Britain. That was the idea. And Napoleon was powerful enough by 1805 that he could scare the Austrians and the Italians and the Germans to not trade with anybody but France, right? And to leave Great Britain out of it, which really made Great Britain angry. Great Britain's response, because they have the giant navy, was to surround all of Western Europe and force any ships coming into Europe to go to Britain before they went to Europe. So that was part of the continental system, was this sort of economic war between Napoleon's France and French Europe and Great Britain, okay? Blockades versus trade deals. And the United States will eventually declare war on England. It's called the War of 1812. And it's something that you'll hear more about. It's on a large stage. It's a pretty small event. For the United States, it's a huge event. For Canada, it's also a pretty big event because they were a British colony at the time. And basically, the War of 1812 was Americans fighting against British in Canada. But regardless of that, the trade problems that were happening, where the British were basically stopping foreign trade from going into Europe, really hurt the American economy. And so the United States will declare war over that, and it's going to be an interesting one. So ultimately, by 1812, here is what Napoleon owns, basically through politics and fear and actually having conquered them. All right. So the blue are territories that Napoleon outright rules because France or because of conquest. Okay, the blue is what Napoleon has gained from outright conquest or prior ownership. The allies of Napoleon are people who Napoleon never had to conquer, but who signed treaties with him because they were too afraid to fight him. Okay, so that's the allies. So this is Napoleonic Europe under the sway of Napoleon. Now, the people that were on the British side, and we're not even talking about the Russians yet, but we will, are over here, the UK and Portugal, Sardinia, and Crete. All these countries and islands are basically trying to fight against Napoleonic power. And so they form together as a type of alliance to try to limit what Napoleon can do. Okay, so that's really where we are. This is the British blockade to try to keep any ships going from Napoleonic Europe from getting out to go trade. It's like a big giant siege of naval ships. And it's also to try to keep foreign ships, say from Canada and America, from going anywhere but to Britain before they go to Europe. So the deal is, guys, this is a huge amount of territory, and we're talking about a wooden navy, biggest navy in the world at the time, where the British put everybody to work on their navy. It's a really harsh experience being in the British Navy. For years at a time, people are on these ships and they're forced to serve, as there's a draft where people are forced to serve in the British Navy. And it's all these ships that are basically maintaining patrol on this huge swath of territory of a couple thousand miles, just to make sure that that French allied Europe suffers from a lack of trade. It sometimes worked, it sometimes didn't. It was kind of nuts, all right? But it's what the British were willing to do. So there's going to be this thing where Napoleon is going to defeat the continental guys. He defeats the Austrians, he defeats the Prussians, who hadn't really joined in yet, and he defeats the Russians, and he defeats German forces in a bunch of separate battles. They just can't beat him. So the third coalition ends after he captures the very important city of Vienna, meaning he being Napoleon. And that's it for that. So around 1805, there's the Battle of Trafalgar where the French fleet's destroyed, but Napoleon defeats all these guys and they're all now under his control. So 1806, the fourth coalition is formed, and that's Britain, Prussia, and Russia that come together to fight against Napoleon. And basically that means that Britain and Russia are sending money and weaponry to Prussia to help them fight. And the Prussians had a really good army at this time, and they went to go fight Napoleon and got their butts kicked. So that's it for the fourth coalition in 1806. This is Napoleonic Europe by the time the fourth coalition is done. And this is where Napoleon should have stopped. People like Napoleon and Alexander the Great and others, they never know when to quit. They just want to, they live for the fight. They don't live for the boring part afterwards where you have to coalesce a state and defend it and create an economy and a government and all that stuff. They don't care about that. It's boring. They just want to fight other people. They just want to, play the game. And so Napoleon didn't know when to stop for his legacy. He just kept on going until he went too far. So where Napoleon should have stopped is right here by 1806, between 1806 and 1810, all right, is everything from roughly Spain all the way over to the Austrian Empire and up into Poland. Napoleon, you guys, I think could have kept all this. I don't think Europe, meaning the Russians and the British, could have beat him if he just stayed here. And really, Hitler was like this too, by the way. He was the same thing, right? He was just like, we shall conquer everything. And of course, the biggest mistake that both made between Napoleon and Hitler were to actually invade Russia, because everyone wants to conquer Russia. But Russia's not that kind of state. You don't just conquer a city like Moscow and suddenly own Russia. It's just too big of a territory, and, snow and harsh winters and everything. So let's get into kind of what happens as a result of Napoleon getting to his height and then going too far. All right. This is the beginning of the end for him. In 1807, everybody is part of Napoleon's continental system. Everybody is under the sway of Napoleon, except for Britain and Portugal, like we were pointing out before. And Spain has been conquered by Napoleon. It's just that, he hasn't been able to occupy the entire territory of Spain. He's only gone into Madrid and he's replaced the government with his own brother. He rules from the palace, but he hasn't conquered Spain. And Napoleon's attempt to conquer Spain, all of it, and then get into Portugal is going to be really what hurts him really bad. That's before he even tries to go into Russia. Okay, so Napoleon is going to replace the King of Spain with his own brother and then try to attack Portugal. And Napoleonic troops are going to get to Portugal, but they're surrounded by Spanish partisans, guerrillas who have not given up. Okay, so here is Joseph, the King of Spain, who is the brother of course, Napoleon. So who do we mean when we talk about guerrillas? A resistant movement erupted in Spain, and the British also sent an expeditionary force to Portugal. And so basically Spanish guerrillas, or partisans we sometimes call them, joined in with a British army under a guy named the Duke of Wellington. His real name is Arthur Wellesley. Same guy. Essentially, the British, under a brilliant Duke of Wellington, who made himself famous in India, is going to be going up against Napoleon's troops who are trying to invade Portugal. And then he's going to go up into Spain, joining with Spanish partisan armies to fight against the Napoleonic troops that are there. I'm going to play you this from Sharp's 3 Rounds, because it's a good idea of the differences between, say, how the French fight and the way the British fought against Napoleon. The British had found a way to beat Napoleonic armies when things were in their favor, and here's that.
Those men who fought in a big battle before. One pace forward. This place is called Talavera. There's going to be a battle here tomorrow. You'll fight in it, maybe even die in it. But you won't see it. There's a lot of smoke in a battle. Our cannon, their cannon. Our shot, their shell. Our volleys, their volleys. You don't see a battle You hear it. Black powder blasting by the ton on all sides. Black smoke blinding you and choking you and making you vomit. And the French come out of the smoke. Not in a line, but in a column. And they march towards our thin line. Kettle drums hammering like hell, and a golden eagle blazing overhead. They march slowly, and it takes them a long time to reach you. And you can't see them in smoke, but you can hear the drums. And they march out of the smoke, and you fire a volley. And the front rank of the column falls, and the next rank steps over them with drums hammering. And the column smashes your line like a hammer breaking glass. And Napoleon has won another battle. But if you don't run, if you stand until you can smell the garlic, and fire volley after volley, 3 rounds a minute, then they slow down. They stop. And then they run away. All you've got to do is stand and fire 3 rounds a minute. Now, you and I know you can fire 3 rounds a minute. But can you stand?
Okay, so there you go. The guerrilla war, Napoleon sending tons and tons of people into Spain to put down the guerrillas of Spain, are going to be like the bleeding ulcer for him. It's going to kill something around 300,000 French troops that keep on being sent into Spain to try to put down the rebellion there. And now the British army has shown up to help the Spanish, and Napoleon's just kind of spread too far, trying to conquer all of Spain. Napoleon, as it says on the slide, misunderstood the nature of the war and was never able to deal with both the guerrilla fighters of Spain and Wellesley at the same time. And so long as the British remained in Portugal, the Spanish guerrillas had supplies. You know, they had hope from Britain to keep on fighting against Napoleon. And it's going to be in 1813. You see how long it took, right? This all starts in 1807. In 1813, on June 21st, Wellesley is able to defeat the French with a combined army of the Spanish and the British and force the French out of Spain entirely. And so that just shows you that that Napoleon's going to get wrapped up here. Loss of this war. When we say the peninsula, we just mean Spain because Spain is a geographic peninsula. It's a bit of territory that juts out of Europe and is surrounded by water on 3 sides. Okay, so Napoleon's decline. Let's continue with that. The 5th coalition is formed, finally. Britain allies with Austria. Austria is ready to fight again because they just saw Napoleon get his butt kicked out of Spain. So Austria is kind of getting uppity again, and we've got our 5th coalition. Here's the problem. Napoleon's army is deteriorating. A lot of the people that were fighting with him were now either dead or they have retired. So there's all these newer people that have been joining the army from various countries that Napoleon rules that are not even French, that have joined in as like lots of mercenaries and stuff. And so his army is getting weaker. And if Napoleon wants to do anything, he's got to do it quick because he's getting weaker just by the fact that he doesn't have good, strong French troops anymore who just believe in him. You know, it's one of those things. He's used all those guys up. But even with that army, Napoleon is still able, with his tactics, to beat the Austrians at a couple of different towns, Asperg, Essling, and also at Wagram. But this was only just barely because of his creative strategy, all right? So the 5th coalition ends, where Austria is beat again, but this is the last time. This is the last time the Austrians are beat. And guess what Napoleon does now? He's lost Spain, but he wants to beat Russia before he does anything else. This is the stupidest thing. So Napoleon now has poorly trained conscripts and foreign troops in his army, all right, with all the nationalistic guys dead or retired. The logistics of this, okay? He decides to invade Russia. Moron! It's 1812. Napoleon goes into Russia. Massive army, 600,000 soldiers, which was huge for the time. And this enormous army has to have a lot of supplies coming behind it to keep these people alive as they're moving into Russia. And Russia is giant, okay? It's huge. So that's a huge supply train. Napoleon is going to very quickly move into Moscow and capture it, which is actually further than Hitler ever got. But the Russians didn't surrender. They went to other places. Leadership and the generals and the army they actually had left Moscow. So when Napoleon got to Moscow, the Russians had left a bunch of traps behind and set the city on fire while the French troops were like billeting themselves in the Russian buildings, right? The Russians are really good at this. They did that against Hitler too. They basically set everything on fire so that the Nazis would starve, and then they set a bunch of traps everywhere just to freak out the Nazis as they kept on marching into Russia. What are the Russians waiting for? Well, it's called winter. They did this twice, again, against Napoleon and against Hitler. Okay, you wait for winter, and winter can do a lot of the work for you because a long supply train, 600,000 soldiers all hanging out in Moscow, trying to survive, waiting to see what happens. The Russian agents set fire to Moscow, that sort of thing. And Napoleon has nowhere to go. He's got nowhere to go, and he's stuck in a burned out Moscow going, well, what the hell do I do now, right? And that's when the Russians strike back, is when the snow starts to fall and it gets to sub-zero temperatures. That's how that works. 30,000 soldiers from the original 600,000 make it back to France, you guys. 30,000. The rest are dead or they fled. And so now we have a coalition, the new one, of British, Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies moving into France, because essentially Napoleon is screwed. Okay, 30,000 troops left, goes back into France, raises another army, but that army is not going to be very good against the combined militaries of all these guys. Okay, so what happens? Napoleon has to give up. April 1814, Napoleon surrenders. A new king is put in charge of France, so France becomes a monarchy again. And Napoleon is put onto Elba Island. It's been turned into a prison island right here, which is right there. Okay, here's the problem. There's a lot of people that want Napoleon back. They didn't want a king over France, and they loved Napoleon, even though Napoleon was not, he went too far. But France prospered under Napoleon way better than it did under anybody else before. So Napoleon is going to get aided by some spies, essentially, who come from France, and they help him get off the island, and they bring him back to France. And Napoleon lands in France on the coastline and starts to march towards Paris, and a French army sent by the new king of France comes to meet him. And that French army sees Napoleon. Napoleon stands up on a tree stump and gives a speech, and that entire army becomes his, because that's just the way Napoleon was. All right. So Napoleonic War number 2 doesn't last as long as the first one. June 18th, 1815, Napoleon has 17,000 soldiers and a huge artillery park. All right. 246 cannons. And he's going to meet up against the British army that has to go back in to fight Napoleon a second time. 68,000 troops and 156 cannons. And they're going to meet at this place called Waterloo, or just south of Waterloo. Going to be a long, drag-out fight all day long. Ultimately, it's a very matched battle, and the French are unable to defeat the British, and the Prussian army will finally show up towards the end of the day. The British were getting close to being defeated when the fresh Prussian army eventually showed up, and Napoleon was not going to be able to also, with his very tired troops at the end of the day, was not going to be able to also defeat the Prussians on top of the British, so he had to surrender and run away and get captured again. So the second time, Napoleon is going to be banished to the island of St. Helena, which is in the middle of I believe it's the Atlantic Ocean. All right, it's like, actually here. I got to show you. This is kind of fun. Where do you put Napoleon the second time? By the way, why do you not kill the guy? Why don't you just execute him with a guillotine or something? The reason is you don't want to turn him into a martyr, because there are a lot of people that would keep on fighting for this guy. Just like the French army did when they had to stop him when he came back from Elba. So, St. Helena. There it is. Right there. It's kind of hard for a guy to kind of, and there was a British Navy just hanging out here, It's kind of hard for Napoleon to get back to France from St. Helena. So Napoleon's going to die there, mostly of boredom, in St. Helena. All right. And then he's going to be buried back in Paris one day. He's still a great man and a military tactician that's going to be studied by people for, well, up until the current day, to be honest with you. It's just as an emperor, he he was not so hot. He could not hold on to an empire because he didn't know when to stop. Napoleon changes how these countries are ruled because he changes their entire systems to be like the new French Napoleonic system, which allows people who were not nobles to have jobs of merit and prosperity and leadership. That was something new, and the people kind of liked it. They liked it, and there's going to be a push for conservative return, like, the old style of kings and nobles. And there's going to be also a push for liberalism, which is we want to change to something different, even if it's going to hurt, so things like constitutional monarchies and stuff. So there's a lot coming. Next week is going to be a big talk about a lot of upheaval and change throughout Europe that leads us finally into the modern era. Okay. And that's all thanks to guys like Napoleon. So thanks a lot. I hope that this didn't bore you too much, and I'll see you next week, sort of.